My parents forbade rock music at home. I had no idea it existed. I had no idea rock music existed. I thought of the Beatles. That was my first music except my parents. Pat Smear, a name that never sought fame, weaves through American rock, punk, grunge, and alternative's most volatile eras. Pat witnessed and helped write history from the Germs' turbulent beginnings to Kurt Cobain's haunting evenings and Foo Fighters' solid years. Pat sat calmly beside Kurt during Nirvana's final MTV Unplugged performance. Cobain's cracking voice is remembered, but few remember the guitarist sitting next to him, sustaining the rhythm like an era's dying breath. He didn't play showy solos or appear on magazine covers, but he was there when it counted. When the band needed a silent listener, Pat fled home at 13 to join a religious community. Music could control a crowd like a cult, he thought. He dwelt in fading genius's shadows. He still performs with Foo Fighters in his 60s, unaffected and unfazed by fame. Life of Pat Smear is a modest rock anthem, stuck between punk's turmoil and rare loyalty in a changing world. Why was this oddball outsider the anchor for American rock's biggest stars? What's behind that half-smile? A grin that mocks and accepts the world. This is about a man who revolted because he couldn't live any other way, not for fame. Early life. Pat Smear, born George Albert Ruthenberg, was born in West Los Angeles on August 5, 1959, into a family that had already rebelled against ethnic borders. His father was a German Jew with war and exile memories. His mother was Native American and African American. Bloodlines have been marginalized in society and history. Pat learned that to survive in a tight apartment with music and cultural disputes, you had to be different or disappear. Pat was smart as a child. Teachers expected him to succeed in advanced academic programs. His parents started him in piano lessons early, and he learned quickly. Pat found a new passion instead of musical theory excellence. Punk is sound without rules, sheet music, or syllabus. He dropped the keyboard, learned himself guitar, and played immediately, emotionally, like battling, not performing. Music wasn't his only descent. Pat fled home at 13, when other kids were still doing homework. He joined the Jesus Commune, a religious community of young people who shunned consumerism and lived together. Why would a clever, mixed-race child from America's loudest metropolis join a semi-isolated religious group? The answer may be loneliness. In an interview, Pat once said, "Everywhere, and I wanted to find a place where I didn't have to explain why I was just being me." But Pat eventually left the commune, perhaps realizing that another kind of extremism was just another kind of cage. When he returned to Los Angeles, he was no longer the shy boy he once was, but a rebellious, sharp-minded, and defiant young man, ready to take on any institution, starting with school. He enrolled in the Innovative Program School, IPS, an alternative education track at University High School designed for students who didn't fit in the traditional system. There he met Jean-Paul Bem, who would later rename himself Darby Crash. The two quickly recognized in each other the same wounds, the same unanswered questions, and a strange belief in the collapse of social order. They read Nietzsche, shared ideas about power, control, and death. They called themselves prophets, not of religion, but of music. For them, punk wasn't a genre. It was an absolute belief. That combination proved too volatile for the school. Both Pat and Darby were expelled for inciting classmates and disrupting order. But instead of seeing it as a failure, they saw it as a first rehearsal. Pushed out of the system, they decided to create their own, a band. And so the Germs were born. Not in a recording studio, not through a talent search, but as a declaration of defiance. We don't belong to this world. So why should we make music the world finds acceptable? Pat Smear, the boy who ran away for religion, got expelled from school, who once hid his intelligence just to fit in, was now stepping into a new chapter. One where he could finally be himself, rebel freely, and most importantly, never have to ask anyone's permission again. Early career. In 1976, at the age of 17, Pat Smear and his friend Darby Crash, born Jean-Paul Bem, formed the band The Germs. They had no formal training, no professional musicianship. They started from zero, quite literally. But to them, music didn't require technique. Punk, as they saw it, wasn't something to be learned. It was something to be believed in. And they believed with extreme conviction. From the very beginning, the Germs didn't resemble any other band. They didn't just play music. They performed like they were conducting a ritual. On stage, Darby Crash would often cut himself, hurl himself into the crowd and scream lyrics like prophetic chants. Pat Smear stood beside him, silently anchoring the chaos with raw, jagged guitar. Like a shaman holding the protective charm. Their shows were chaotic, violent, even banned in many venues. But for the disillusioned youth of Los Angeles, it was a rallying cry, a well-timed earthquake. Pat and Darby believed themselves to be a kind of cultural cult leaders. They read Nietzsche, quoted Hitler, and cultivated a circle of loyal punk followers as if running a movement. For Pat, music was a way to control minds. He once described the stage as a social experiment where we held total power. At a time when punk was still emerging, they had already grasped the force of chaos. In 1977, the band recorded their first single, Forming, rough, offbeat, and nearly unlistenable to mainstream audiences. But that was the point. Their music refused to compromise. Their peak came with GI, their only album, released in 1979 and produced by Joan Jett of the Runaways. Today, GI is considered one of America's earliest and most influential punk albums. Though it never charted, it would later be recognized as a foundational work, shaping generations of punk and alternative artists. Symbolic success didn't bring stability. The Germs quickly unraveled in a mess of addiction, violence, and loss of control. The same chaos they unleashed on stage consumed them off stage. The romantic relationship between Pat Smear and the band's first drummer, Rob Henley, also grew tense and complicated. Internal conflict tore the group apart just as thoroughly as they had torn through the scene. On December 7, 1980, Darby Crash died of a heroin overdose in an intentional suicide. He left a note, hoping his death would be remembered. But the next day, John Lennon was assassinated and Darby was forgotten in the flood of global headlines. For Pat Smear, it was a devastating blow. His closest friend, his musical partner, his co-founder in belief and chaos was gone. The Germs were over. A wild chapter had closed, leaving Pat disoriented, adrift. No band, no stage, and no extreme ideals left to cling to. He didn't quit music, but he didn't chase the past either. Pat disappeared for a while, quietly observing as punk became increasingly commercialized. And then, one day, he reappeared, this time beside Kurt Cobain. A new era was coming, and Pat, who had survived the first punk riots, was about to step into the center of another storm, Nirvana. Nirvana, and the turning point when Pat Smear entered Nirvana's world in 1993, he was no longer the wild punk wandering through grimy clubs in Los Angeles. He was a survivor, someone who had witnessed the death of an icon, buried an ideal and fallen into silence amidst the screams. And then, unexpectedly, it was Kurt Cobain, the reluctant savior of the grunge generation, who brought him back into the spotlight. Pat and Kurt met through Joan Jett, who had produced GI, the only album by the Germs. But Kurt didn't choose Pat for his technique, fame, or youth. It was something else. A rawness, a spirit that couldn't be faked. In Kurt's eyes, Pat wasn't just a musician. He was a living manifesto of uncompromising resistance. Someone who could understand, feel, and play with a spirit of self-destruction, without needing tragedy to make a point. In September 1993, Pat officially joined Nirvana as the rhythm guitarist for the In Utero tour, the band's final tour. He blended in immediately without needing an introduction. Pat didn't play to stand out, he played to hold things together. In Kurt's fractured world, Pat was the one who kept the rhythm, kept the structure, kept the stage from collapsing. The most historic moment came with MTV Unplugged in New York, recorded on November 18, 1993. The stage was dim, covered in white chrysanthemums like a funeral in progress. Pat sat to Kurt's left, quiet, focused, not wasting a single gesture. His guitar didn't dominate or show off, but every note carried the weight of loneliness. Pat was the only musician to ever play alongside Kurt on an official Nirvana stage. And that night, the world saw, for the first and only time, a Kurt Cobain who didn't scream, but whispered his final words. A few months later, Nirvana ended their European tour. Kurt became increasingly unstable and Pat, like everyone else, was helpless in the face of the unraveling. On April 5, 1994, Kurt died by suicide in Seattle. For Pat, it was a blow all too familiar, yet still painful. Darby Crash had died in silence. Now, another genius chose to leave, this time in front of the whole world. Nirvana disbanded, grunge lost its soul. But in the ashes, Pat Smear once again stood quietly. No interviews, no speeches. He didn't chase fame by retelling the past. He simply kept living as a witness. And then it was Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, who pulled Pat back from the brink of being forgotten. A new band was born, Foo Fighters. And once again, Pat was there, not to start something new, but to help the survivors find their breath again. Foo Fighters and the Years of Endurance. When Nirvana disbanded after Kurt Cobain's death, those left behind, Dave Grohl and Pat Smear, didn't just lose a friend. They lost their definition of music, of themselves, of what the future could be. Amid grief, doubt, and the pressure to rise from the ashes, Dave made an unexpected decision: to start a new band. Foo Fighters was born in 1994 as a way for Dave to heal. He recorded the first songs entirely on his own, playing every instrument. But when it came time to take that music on stage, Dave didn't pick just any guitarist. He called Pat Smear, the man who had seen it all and was still standing. For Pat, the invitation wasn't about fame. It was a handshake between two survivors, a silent alliance that needed no explanation. He agreed without hesitation. And so, Pat became the first official member to join Foo Fighters, before the band even knew exactly what it would become. From 1995 to 1997, these were turbulent, yet defining years. Foo Fighters had to start over from scratch, with Nirvana's shadow looming behind them. Pat didn't just bring rhythm guitar, he brought a strange sense of stability, a steady pulse in a world that had just come undone. In early videos like Big Me, This Is a Call, and Monkey Wrench, Pat always stood in the background, never trying to shine but impossible to overlook. However, after 3 solid years, just as Foo Fighters were gaining momentum, abruptly left the band in 1997. The media called it a surprise departure, but to those who knew him, it wasn't an ending. It was a necessary pause. In later interviews, Pat admitted he was burnt out by the rock star lifestyle, endless touring, unfamiliar hotels, and the disorientation he had first tasted back in his Germs days. There was also a quieter emotional fracture whispered among fans. Pat's friendship with Dave Grohl may have been strained by Dave's divorce from Jennifer Youngblood, someone Pat was very close to. No one confirmed it. No one denied it. But clearly, Pat's departure carried more than one reason. He vanished from the stage. No solo albums, no new bands. He simply lived. As if, after surviving so much, he just needed to step away from the race, to find a real breath for himself. Then in 2005, Pat made an unannounced return to the stage with Foo Fighters at the MTV Video Music Awards. No big statement, no press release. He just walked on, picked up a guitar, and played as if he had never left. From then on, Pat officially rejoined Foo Fighters, not as a guest, but as a full-time member, a silent cornerstone. And for more than a decade, he would be part of the band's most defining albums. With Wasting Light, 2011, Pat was there as the band returned to raw rock, recording on analog tape in Dave's garage. With Sonic Highways, 2014, he traveled to 8 American cities, recording each song in a different historic studio. On Concrete and Gold, 2017, Foo Fighters expanded their sound like never before. And with Medicine at Midnight, 2021, while many of their peers had faded, the band stood strong and Pat was still there, wearing that signature half-smile, a living symbol of endurance. In 2021, Pat Smear was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as part of Foo Fighters. For him, it wasn't a peak of fame, it was history's quiet knock. That the misfit kid once expelled from school, once drenched in blood and punk riots, had come full circle to become an essential piece of a lasting rock legacy. Foo Fighters have gone through many changes, many losses. But Pat always returns, right on time, never asking for the spotlight, never needing to be the first name remembered, but always present when the band needs someone to keep the rhythm, both in music and in life. A complex mind and a life off-center. If you only saw Pat Smear on stage, with his frizzy hair, crooked smile, and unfussy guitar playing, you might be quick to label him odd. But beneath that exterior lies a layered, contradictory personality that has never been fully explained. Pat didn't live to be understood. He lived in a way no one else dared to. Even as a child, he pretended to be dumb, just to be accepted. A gifted student, placed in advanced programs, Pat quickly realized that intelligence wasn't valued in the communities he grew up in. So he hid it, played the fool, a mask to survive. That was his first paradox, a man who understood the world too well, choosing to live as if he didn't understand it at all. At 13, he ran away from home and joined a reclusive religious commune. No one knows exactly what drove him to leave his family. But perhaps it was the longing to believe in something absolute, whether it be God or music. When he returned, he threw himself into punk with the same intensity. The Germs for him and Darby Crash weren't just a band, they were a spiritual cult. Pat believed music could control a crowd. He and Darby saw themselves as punk prophets, using sound to manipulate the audience's psyche, a mix of social experiment, ritual, and total chaos. They were obsessed with Nietzschean philosophy and even quoted Adolf Hitler, not as political propaganda, but as a way to explore power and the obsession with control. That made them both idolized and condemned in the punk community. Pat's personal life was equally non-traditional. He once had a deep same-sex relationship with Rob Henley, the original drummer of the Germs. They lived together as a couple, though it was never publicly acknowledged. When the relationship ended, it left emotional scars and contributed to the band's internal collapse. Though he never formally came out, became a quiet queer icon, respected in the LGBTQ+ rock scene for his honesty and refusal to make a spectacle of his identity. Old friends, especially those from the Germs era, have suggested that Pat showed signs of bipolar disorder. with clear manic and depressive cycles. Though never formally diagnosed, it helps explain his recurring disappearances, quiet reappearances, and silent retreats throughout his career. When things became too much, Pat stepped back. No explanations, no complaints, just a deep awareness of his own limits. Outside of music, Pat fostered a bizarre private world, a love for exotic animals. On tour, he would travel with rats, spiders, lizards, snakes, even raising a bearded dragon as a pet. Bandmates were confused. Audiences were intrigued. But for Pat, the world always had more strange corners than people like to admit. He simply chose to live with them, not avoid them. He once said a line that, for many, became a life motto. But for Pat, it was just truth. Punk was never about fashion. It was about saying F you with a smile. Through that lens, Pat Smear was never weird for the sake of being shocking. He just had no interest in pretending to be normal. In an industry that defines artists by fame, image, and accolades, Pat chose to disappear into the sound of his guitar and let everything else pass by like a quiet laugh, cold, kind, and unlike anyone else. Solo career and other ventures. When people talk about Pat Smear, they usually mention the Germs, Nirvana, or Foo Fighters. Few know that behind those major chapters, he also carved out a path of his own. Quiet, strange, and perfectly true to the spirit of, I don't need to fit in. After Darby Crash's death and the breakup of the Germs, Pat entered the early 1980s feeling adrift. He didn't jump into another band or chase the rising wave of hardcore punk. Instead, he turned inward, writing, recording, and playing music on his own terms, free from managers or record label constraints. And so his short but colorful solo career began. In 1987, he released his first solo album, Ruthin Smear, a clever play on his real last name, Ruthenberg, and a reminder that this was music entirely his own. The album leaned into experimental rock, raw, abrasive, odd, and completely unbound by commercial structure. It wasn't a commercial success, nor was it widely promoted, but to those who understood Pat, it stood as an artistic manifesto of someone who refused to compromise. In 1992, as alternative rock began to surge, he released his second solo album, So You Fell in Love with a Musician. Softer in tone, rich in sarcasm, and satirical of the backstage relationships between artists and fans, it didn't spawn any hits or music videos, but it charmed with its subtle wit, an eccentric artist writing about the absurdities of an eccentric industry. But music wasn't the only path Pat explored. In the early 1980s, as punk temporarily withdrew from the mainstream, he unexpectedly turned to television, dabbling in acts. He appeared in a 1984 episode of the popular action series Chips, a small, mostly silent role, but it revealed another side of Pat that few imagined, a curiosity for all forms of artistic expression, so long as it wasn't forced. He later participated in a few underground films and indie projects, then quietly withdrew, as he always did when things started to feel like an obligation. Beyond performing and songwriting, Pat also collaborated with guitar companies to develop custom instruments that reflected his unique style. Throughout his career, he was closely associated with Hagstrom guitars, known for their vintage design, thick tone, and suitability for punk and alternative rock. Pat helped design a few signature models, though he never heavily promoted them. To him, a guitar wasn't a performance weapon. It was a companion that needed to understand its player's temperament. Though rarely in the media spotlight, quietly continued to inspire others through small workshops and community meetups with young artists, especially those who felt like they didn't belong in the traditional music world. He never told them to aim for fame. Instead, he repeated what he himself had lived. Music won't save you from life, but if you're honest enough, it'll make you stop fearing it. Pat Smear's solo career wasn't long or flashy, but it was a space all his own where he could pour out his quiet reflections when he didn't have to keep time for anyone, didn't have to be part of any legendary band, and didn't have to perform punk the right way. Legacy and influence. Pat Smear was never the focal point of any band. He wasn't a frontman, didn't write hit songs, and never had a chart-topping solo. But looking back on over 4 decades of American rock, it becomes clear Pat was always there. At the right time, in the right place, being exactly who he was. He is the only person to have co-founded a legendary punk band, played alongside the icon of grunge, and helped build one of the most enduring modern rock bands in the world. No one else can say they've played guitar in the Germs, Nirvana, and Foo Fighters, 3 names from 3 different eras with 3 seemingly incompatible musical spirits. With the Germs, he and Darby Crash didn't just create punk, they redefined it as a spiritual ritual. Those who witnessed their performances agreed. It wasn't a show, it was pure release. Raw, violent, and unapologetic. GI, their sole album, wasn't successful at release, but later became a foundational document for generations of punk artists. Figures like Dave Grohl, Kathleen Hanna, and Billy Joe Armstrong have all cited it as an unwritten punk gospel. In Nirvana, he became the quiet, indispensable presence during their legendary MTV Unplugged in New York performance, a night when fragility and pain were rendered in hauntingly simple music. Pat didn't seek the spotlight, but his presence helped Kurt stay grounded, musically and emotionally. With Foo Fighters, he became the soft backbone, the one who didn't change, didn't demand, didn't crumble when everything else around him did. Through lineup changes, crises, and tragedies, like the sudden death of Taylor Hawkins in 2022, remained a silent witness, still playing, still keeping the fire alive. Pat's influence doesn't lie in loud declarations. It lives in his unwavering authenticity, his refusal to chase trends, and his resistance to selling out an image. To the underground scene, he's a symbol of existing without conforming. To the queer community within rock, a space that hasn't always been welcoming, he embodies self-acceptance without spectacle. And to younger bands, he's proof that you can live fully through music without trading your soul for fame. In 2021, when Pat Smear was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Foo Fighters, he took the stage with his familiar half-smile. No long speeches, no nostalgic glory, just a look. The look of someone who has seen it all fall apart and still chooses to stay and rebuild. Not everyone knows who Pat Smear is, but those who do understand this. Rock would be missing a vital current in its bloodstream without him. Present life at 65, Pat Smear hasn't slowed down, not when he's still holding his familiar guitar, standing beside Dave Grohl on the world's biggest stages. In 2024 and 2025, Pat hasn't just continued performing with Foo Fighters. He's proven in his quiet but unwavering way that you're never too old to rock. Throughout the summer of 2024, Pat joined Foo Fighters on their Everything or Nothing at All World Tour, running from May to August across stadiums in North America and Europe. On stage, he remained the steady anchor, not flashy, not seeking the spotlight, but always the backbone the band could rely on. At the Cardiff and London shows, joined the band in welcoming Violet Grohl, Dave's daughter, and Shane Hawkins, son of late drummer Taylor Hawkins, on stage. A symbolic moment where old and new generations met through music. Offstage, Pat hasn't lost his signature quirkiness and understated charm. Before Foo Fighters' show at London Stadium, he was spotted attending Taylor Swift's The Eras Tour. A veteran rocker among a sea of Swifties sent social media buzzing. A delightful crossover between two musical worlds. But that's Pat Smear, someone who's never cared about being on brand or playing a role. He listens to music simply because he enjoys it. That's all. In 2025, the journey continues, and Pat is still present. Foo Fighters have confirmed their performance at the Singapore Grand Prix on October 4, 2025, alongside major acts like Elton John and Smashing Pumpkins. A full Asian tour is also scheduled, with stops in Jakarta, Tokyo, and Osaka. With this schedule, Pat, now 66, will continue performing night after night, across time zones, climates, and cultures, without complaint. Because for him, music isn't a burden. It's part of his breath. The Pat Smear of today is his most complete self, an artist who never needed to shout to be heard, a misfit who found solid ground without sacrificing his identity, and a man who didn't step into old age to rest, but to keep living the way he always has, unboxed, unapologetic, and forever playing. Pat Smear's story isn't just a musical journey. It's a quiet affirmation that you can live differently, never be the loudest, and still be an essential part of something monumental. If you believe artists like Pat Smear, those who don't need the spotlight to shine, still deserve to be remembered and celebrated, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow more real stories we bring to life. Did you first discover Pat Smear through the Germs, Nirvana, or Foo Fighters? Share your memory in the comments, because music isn't just sound. It's memory. It's feeling. It's what stays with us through the years. See you in the next videos where we keep telling true journeys of real people.